I'm Karen Taylor, Program Director of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York. And I'm delighted to welcome both our online and in-person audience to tonight's lecture. Preserving New York City's rich cultural heritage with Kate Lemos McHale, Director of Research at the NYC Landmarks Preservation, also known as LPC. I want to thank the New York Landmarks Conservancy for their partnership support this evening. For those of you who may be less familiar with the General Society, a brief introduction. The General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York was founded in 1785 by 22 skilled artisans. Today, our 238-year-old organization continues to serve and improve the quality of life of the people of the City of New York through our educational and cultural programs. These include our John M. Mossman Locke Museum, and I'm indicating to our in-person audience that it is upstairs and you're welcome to visit it after our lecture tonight. Our General Society Library, of course, of which we're in this evening. Our tuition-free Mechanics Institute, and our nearly 200-year-old lecture series, of course, of which tonight's talk is part of. For the online audience, please feel free to submit typed questions throughout the lecture through the Q&A section, and of course, at the conclusion of the talk. We would ask that you use the Q&A section rather than raise your hand or use the chat section. For the in-person audience, we ask that you save your questions to the end. Kate Lemos McHale is the Director of Research at NYC Landmarks Preservation Commission, where she manages the research department and the agency's evaluation and designation of landmarks and historic districts. She has guided designations across the city that recognize sites of important architectural, cultural, and historical significance, and has overseen the creation of several interactive story maps highlighting landmarks that represent the city's diverse history. Kate joined LPC in 2016 with an extensive background in historic preservation, architecture, and planning in New York City, including at Beyer, Blinder, Bell Architects and Planners, and Higgins, Quasbarth and Partners, and as an instructor at Pratt's Institute School of Continued and Professional Studies, and is co-author of the architectural monograph, Carriere and Hastings Architects. It is my huge pleasure to introduce Kate Lemos McHale to you. Thank you, Kate.
Thank you so much, Karen, and thanks everyone for being here. I'm delighted to be here to talk through many stories of important history that are embodied in New York City landmarks. Just first, a quick introduction about the Landmarks Preservation Commission, which you probably are familiar with. We are the mayoral agency responsible for designating and regulating significant sites and historic districts throughout the city. We are the largest municipal preservation commission in the country, and we have an incredible staff, including dedicated historic preservationists, historians, and administrators that allow the city to preserve sites of significant history and architecture. I do have the honor of directing the research department, where we are charged with research, evaluation, survey, and designation. And our preservation department works with property owners to help preserve and protect all the city's important heritage. Today, there are more than 37,800 landmark properties in New York City, most of which are located in our 156 historic districts. Let's see if I can get this process right. There we go. All right, so tonight I would love to talk about culturally significant landmarks and to really tell a story through them which I will admit out front is limited. This is a small selection of the many that are designated and a small selection of the many, many stories and layers of history that, of course, we have in our city and in our landmarks. New York City's diversity is its greatest strength, essential to its significance as a thriving cultural, intellectual, artistic, and economic center. Key to LPC's goal of addressing equity in every aspect of our work is the goal to ensure diversity and inclusion in designations, to better recognize, preserve, and tell the story of all New Yorkers. Designated landmarks and historic districts protect and preserve the city's significant architecture and its history. While all are historic, not all are architectural icons or even necessarily distinctive for their architecture. So it's not always evident without digging deeper into the history of the buildings, why they are worth preserving. For more than 5 decades, LPC has been recognizing, supporting, and celebrating significant places associated with African American, women's, Latino, LGBTQ, immigrant history, and that of many immigrant communities. Which I've just said. I will share a selection of some of these New York City landmarks and significant people and groups, and acknowledge the history of prejudice and discrimination, and help us appreciate the richness of our diverse collective history. I'll go through these chronologically, beginning with vestiges of the city's earliest days from the pre-Columbian era through the Civil War. We'll start with 3 actually that are not buildings at all. Prior to European contact in the 1620s, what is now New York City was home to hundreds of generations of Native Americans who adapted to the land and its geography and ecology dramatically as its ecology dramatically changed. The earliest groups moved frequently to hunt, and later groups settled in villages to utilize abundant resources. This Dutch map indicates where the settlements were located in the 1630s. New York Harbor has always been an important estuary. It significantly shaped the area's ecosystem. Indigenous peoples relied upon the area's abundant resources, including oysters, fish, and game. In 2021, LPC designated the Akawahang Munahanang, which translates from the Munsee language to mean island protected from the wind, archaeological site. It's the city's first landmark recognizing the many generations of Native Americans who lived in this area. To recognize and protect its significant archaeological resources. The site is located in Conference House Park at the southern tip of Staten Island, and is associated with over 8,000 years of occupation by indigenous peoples. It contains the region's best preserved archaeological site and cultural complex associated with the indigenous presence in New York City. In this designation, we worked closely with the city's federally recognized tribes, and they actually helped us inform us on the correct translation of what we understood the original name of the site to be into Munsee. So it's also the first landmark to be in the Munsee language. During the period of Dutch rule, most settlers lived at Manhattan's far southern tip with easy access to the harbor facilities on which the colony depended. North of the settlement, protected as you can see here by a palisade, which is a high wall for which Wall Street is named, a number of large farms or boweries, as well as smaller plantations were established. New York came under British rule in 1664 and continued to develop into a major center for shipping and trade. This drawing shows the 1660 street plan of New Amsterdam, which formed the basis of today's city. In 1983, LPC designated the remaining street plan an individual landmark as a striking reminder of New York's colonial past and virtually the only above ground physical evidence in Manhattan of the Dutch presence in the 17th century. People of African descent have lived in and shaped New York City since its earliest European settlement, significantly contributing to the city's growth into an international cultural and economic capital. In 1626, the Dutch West India Company first brought enslaved people from Africa to New Amsterdam, And through the 17th and 18th centuries, the physical and economic growth of the city relied on their labor in the port, construction, mills, residences, and farms. Under Dutch rule, enslaved Africans had the possibility of obtaining half or wholly free status, and some received grants of land north of the settled area of New Amsterdam. When the British took over in 1664, the practice of slavery became more entrenched. By 1740, 20% of New York's residents were enslaved. The northern portion of what was known as the Commons in the area of today's City Hall Park was an African burial ground in the 18th century. In recognition of its incredible historic significance, the African Burial Ground and Commons Historic District was designated in 1993, the city's only archaeological historic district. And the African Burial Ground was designated a national monument. Many landmarks have hidden layers of history. Enslaved labor remained central to New York's economy through the early 19th century. In parts of Brooklyn, for example, the percentage of white households with enslaved people at times exceeded that of South Carolina. Many farms and large estates are known to have enslaved Africans before emancipation and/or employed free Black men and women. While most of these were demolished as the city urbanized, designated landmarks such as the Morris Jamel Mansion and the Lefferts Homestead shown here, both designated in 1967, provide a tangible connection to this history. They are owned by the New York City Department of Parks and Recreation and operated by the Historic House Trust. The trust is developing interpretive tools to recognize the history of enslaved people at many of its sites, including these. Recent restorative and interpretive work at the Lefferts Homestead in Prospect Park received a Lucy Moses Award from the Landmarks Conservancy this year. By 1830, New York City had the North's largest free Black community, with almost 14,000 free Black residents and many important institutions such as churches, newspapers, fraternal clubs, and benevolent organizations. African-American communities thrived in Lower Manhattan and in Brooklyn neighborhoods of Dumbo, Vinegar Hill, Brooklyn Heights, downtown, and Williamsburg. Today's South Village and Sullivan Thompson historic districts contain buildings dating to the 19th century, when a free Black community known as Little Africa was home to nearly a quarter of the city's Black population. And the designations of these historic districts recognize this history and preserve what remains. African Americans also built enclaves in rural areas. The houses on Hunterfly Road, shown here in Brooklyn, were designated landmarks in 1970. They're the last remaining structures from Weeksville, a 19th century community of free Black landowners established in the 1830s. Weeksville was once a remote area and a safe haven for African Americans, free and enslaved. The village offered African American landowners citizenship and voting rights during the pre-Civil War era and provided safety to those on the road to freedom. Restored in 2005 as the Weeksville Heritage Center, a living museum of African American history and culture, they now serve as a museum that documents, preserves, and interprets the history of free African communities. Despite New York's history of enslavement and economic ties to the South, it was an important center of abolitionist activity and a crucial way station on the Underground Railroad. Many of the most famous abolitionists who escaped slavery, such as Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Harriet Jacobs, and Henry Box Brown, passed through New York or Brooklyn, and many prominent abolitionists lived here. Several homes of abolitionists and religious institutions known to oppose slavery, and in some cases with documented history of assisting people along the Underground Railroad, have been designated landmarks. Some of them are shown here, and they include churches like Plymouth Church, that was known as the Grand Central Station of the Underground Railroad. That's in the Brooklyn Heights Historic District. Also a very important African-American church, the first free congregational church in downtown Brooklyn, was very active in the fight against slavery. The Lamartine Place Historic District, which is shown here on the bottom, is located in Manhattan. And it includes the home of Abigail Hopper Gibbons, who was a very important suffragist and abolitionist. She was very active in the mid to late 19th century, and her home was a target of threats of violence during the draft riots of 1863. And so I think she's a very interesting example of connections that we find between these histories. And the different themes of significance that we see of women, of suffragists, of abolitionists. And so I think you'll see probably a lot of these throughout tonight's lecture. Will have many themes and often are interconnected. Following the Civil War, increased migration of African Americans from southern states, and large-scale development of public transportation and infrastructure led to the dramatic growth of the city's diverse residential areas, commercial centers, industrial and manufacturing zones, and public amenities such as parks, parkways, boardwalks, and recreational facilities. Even in the absence of Jim Crow laws in New York City, during this time, African Americans here faced societal racism and widespread discrimination, including the segregation of New York City schools. This was also a period associated with important reform movements, establishment of the NAACP and other impactful organizations, and the intensification of the women's suffrage movement. The community of Sandy Ground in Staten Island emerged as a thriving community for free African Americans 2 decades before the Civil War and experienced its golden age in the 1880s and 90s. Many of the residents worked in the oyster trade, owned property, built substantial houses, and established successful businesses and institutions, chief among them the Rossville AME Zion Church, which is shown here. And across the street on Bloomingdale Road are 2 workers' cottages that were constructed between 1887 and 1898. And these were all designated as individual landmarks in 2011 as tangible links to Sandy Ground's rich history. The former Colored School number 3 was designated an individual landmark in 1998 and is a reminder of New York City's policy of race-based school segregation during the 19th century. Though the New York City Board of Education adopted a plan for incremental desegregation and elimination of separate, quote, colored schools by 1883, they remained in Manhattan, Brooklyn, and Queens until around 1900. The former Colored School number 3 was built in 1879 to 81 in Williamsburg in Brooklyn. It's the only known, quote, colored school building remaining in Brooklyn from this era. Several notable African-American educators were associated with this school, including Brooklyn's first Black female principal, Catherine Clow, who served the school for many years. The former Colored School number 4 in Manhattan is currently calendared for consideration as a landmark. It's Manhattan's only known surviving example of a racially segregated school from the period between the Civil War and the post-Reconstruction era. This extraordinarily significant and modest former public school building was built in 1850, became segregated colored school in 1860, and continued to serve Black students until it closed in 1894. Sarah J. Tompkins Garnett, whose family were well-to-do Brooklyn farmers and merchants, became the principal of the school and was notable as one of the first African-American female principals within the city's school system. The school is also associated with many prominent former students who went on to lead in their field, and it is an important reminder of this history. At the same time, Alice Austin was a pioneering photographer of New York City's social milieu. Unlike the romantic style of many of her contemporaries, Austin favored realistic documentary images of the world around her. She inherited this house on Staten Island from her father in 1880 and lived here for many years. The Alice Austin House was designated a landmark in 1971. Subsequent scholarship revealed that Austin had lived openly at the cottage with her partner of 53 years, Gertrude Tate, from 1917 to 1945. Her home and studio, which operates as a house museum and interpretive center, is now recognized for its significance to LGBTQ history. Lewis Latimer was born in Massachusetts in 1848 to parents who had escaped slavery. He taught himself technical drawing and later worked with Alexander Graham Bell, making the initial technical drawings for the patent application for the first telephone. At the United States Electric Light Company, he oversaw installation of lighting in major cities around the world and advanced technology for incandescent lighting, and then later went to work for Thomas Edison. The Queen Anne style frame house, built in the late 1880s, was acquired by Lewis and his wife in 1902 and remained in their family until 1963. It became a meeting place for prominent African American civic and cultural leaders. You can see this photo here from the designation in 1995. It was moved from its original location in 1988 to avoid demolition. And that happened around the time of designation. And designation also recognized the additions that the Latimers themselves had made to the house. It's now a house museum dedicated to the renowned African-American inventor, and its restoration was awarded a 2019 Lucy Moses Award from the Landmarks Conservancy. During the post-Reconstruction era between 1893 and about 1910, West 28th Street, which at that time was in the area known as the Tenderloin, between Broadway and 6th Avenue, contained the most significant concentration of sheet music publishers in New York City, referred to as Tin Pan Alley, to evoke the racket of piano music audible on the block. Tin Pan Alley arose about a decade after immigration of Jewish refugees from Eastern Europe to New York City began in the early 1880s, and during the Great Migration, when significant numbers of African Americans came to New York City in search of opportunities unavailable in the Jim Crow era South. Tin Pan Alley represents a number of milestones for the participation of African American and Jewish artists in mainstream music production. Despite the discrimination they faced and the racist caricatures and stereotypes of African Americans increasingly spread through mass media, including sheet music at this time. Within these 5 landmarks, collaborative firms of sheet music publishers and printers, working with composers, arrangers, lyricists, and performers, left an indelible mark on the creation, production, and promotion of American popular music. The designation of these landmarks received widespread support, including from descendants of composers and performers, J. Rosamond Johnson, James Reese Europe, Noble Sissel, and Duke Ellington. The NAACP was founded in 1909 to fight racial injustice and prejudice through legal and educational means. It was headquartered in 75th Avenue in Greenwich Village from 1914 to 23, during a period of substantial national growth. It was here where W.E.B. Du Bois, who helped found the organization, was director of publications and research, and also edited the Crisis magazine, and where James Weldon Johnson became the first African-American to lead the NAACP, organized the silent march down 5th Avenue in 1917 to protest violence against Black people, and oversaw the establishment of hundreds of new local branches nationwide. The educational building at 75th Avenue was designated in 2021. Along with the NAACP's national office, it was home to a remarkable group of tenants that shaped American thought and society, including many women's organizations working for peace at the time of World War I. It was sometimes referred to as the Peace Building. And the organization that would become the ACLU also was founded in this building. The years between 1915 and 1945 brought many political, geographic, and cultural shifts in New York City, the nation, and the world. African Americans advanced their status within American society, while also continuing to face systemic discrimination in nearly every aspect of life, including housing, voting, education, and basic economic opportunity. The 1917 Jones Act recognized Puerto Ricans as American citizens, and Puerto Rican population in New York grew steadily during this period, establishing an enclave in East Harlem that became known as El Barrio, or, quote, the neighborhood. This period saw radical shifts, including the passage of women's suffrage in 1920, the Harlem Renaissance, then the early civil rights movement. Many individual landmarks and historic districts represent this important time period and the experiences, achievements, and contributions of significant individuals and groups. Shown here is the sculptor Augusta Savage working on her harp sculpture, which was presented in the 1939 World's Fair. She had a studio in the Dorrance Brooks Historic District in Harlem. Also pictured are Langston Hughes and friends, who often met for literary salons within the same historic district. Many important community institutions from the Harlem Renaissance are designated landmarks. These are just a few, located around 135th Street, the New York Public Library's West 135th Street branch, which was designed in 1904 by McKim, Mead, and White and became a center of Black intellectual life in the 1920s. It housed the Schomburg Collection of Black History and Culture, compiled by Arthur A. Schomburg, a Black historian from Puerto Rico. Many Harlem churches are significant for both their architecture and their role in the African American community. The Mother African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church on West 137th Street has a long and illustrious history of religious and social activism known as the Freedom Church because of its important role in the abolitionist movement and the Underground Railroad. The 369th Regiment Armory, designated a landmark in 1985, was home to the African American regiment known as the Harlem Hellfighters in World War I. African American soldiers served in segregated regiments in World War I. The Harlem Hellfighters were assigned to the French Army in April 1918 and fought 191 consecutive days, longer than any other regiment. Any other unit in the war. For their bravery, members received individual and collective medals and elite honors, and in February 1919, 1,300 Black soldiers of the 369th Regiment were welcomed as heroes with a parade up Fifth Avenue towards Harlem, even as they continued to face racism at home. And this is an image of people watching and cheering on that parade. This map shows historic districts and individual landmarks in Harlem, recognizing its important history and culture. Historic districts have been designated in Harlem since the Commission's earliest years, starting with the St. Nicholas Historic District in 1967. Designed by the preeminent architectural firms of McKim, Mead, and White, James Brown Lord, and Bruce Price and Clarence Luce in 1891, the historic district's model row houses were considered among the most prestigious in Harlem in the early 20th century. Because of racist restrictive covenants, African Americans were barred from living here until around 1919. But by the 1930s, it had attracted so many prosperous Black residents that it became known as Strivers Row. More recently, the Commission designated the Dorrance Brooks Square Historic District, adjacent to Strivers Row, which has remarkable late 19th century and early 20th century architecture and cultural significance related to the Harlem Renaissance. Dorrance Brooks was a Black serviceman who died in action while serving with the segregated military in World War I. The park dedicated to his name in 1925 was the first public space in New York City to honor an African-American in this way. And the historic district is the city's first district named for an African-American. In researching the history of the intact rows of late 19th century row houses that define the character of the central Harlem, West 130th to 132nd Street Historic District, LPC staff's deliberate and intensive research uncovered the previously untold story of how Harlem residents adapted many of these residential buildings to accommodate a variety of cultural, religious, civic, and political uses, and how these institutions sustained the community and fostered social justice. Professional and social organizations such as the New Amsterdam Musical Association, or NAMA, which is the oldest African-American musical association in the United States, and the Alpha Physical Culture Club, the first all-Black athletic club in the United States, sought to meet the needs of a community that was kept out of the equivalent white-only groups of Manhattan. It was also here later in the 1960s, in a house redesigned in 1928 by the African-American architect Vertner Tandy, that Bayard Rustin led the national headquarters and planned the March on Washington. LPC has also designated large housing developments, important for innovations in design and planning, and in some cases, reminders of our history of racist housing policies. The Dunbar Apartments, named after the poet Paul Laurence Dunbar, was the first large cooperative apartment building built for African Americans and Manhattan's earliest garden apartment complex. It was designated an individual landmark in 1970. Prominent co-op owners included County Cullen, W.E.B. Du Bois, A. Philip Randolph, and Paul Robeson. The Harlem River Houses, which is the complex shown on the upper right, was built in 1936 and was the first federally funded, built, and owned housing project in New York City. It was built during a time when public housing in New York was racially segregated under policies determined by the Public Works Administration. Its design represents a collaboration between architects and planners, and a group of prominent Harlem citizens provided input, resulting in amenities specifically designed to meet the needs of its residents, such as a nursery school, health clinic, and social rooms. LPC designated this large complex an individual landmark in 1975, and it's currently going through a major rehabilitation with a lot of restoration work and upgrades in the shared courtyard area, HVAC, and other repairs. In Brooklyn, neighborhoods such as Bedford-Stuyvesant, Fort Greene, and Crown Heights North drew large populations of African-American and Afro-Caribbean residents by the 1930s, and several historic districts in Brooklyn represent significant African-American history there. This map shows where they're located in central Brooklyn. Many of these, like the Bedford district shown in the photo, contain some of Brooklyn's most elegant and intact 19th century streetscapes, and contain important institutions and were home to significant individuals. Shifting to education for a moment and to the Bronx, during this period, the Samuel Gompers Industrial High School was constructed in the South Bronx. Designated last year, this significant civic structure was designed in the mid-1920s by school architects William H. Gompert and Walter C. Martin, and features arcaded brick facades and richly ornamented towers that blend medieval revival and Art Deco aesthetics. And they have these incredible carved stone panels that depict different aspects of technology, including electricity and architecture and mechanics and flight. It's really an incredible building. This was originally planned as Bronx Vocational High School and renamed in the 1920s for Samuel Gompers. The first and longest serving president of the American Federation of Labor. The Wall Street Journal reported it had one of the most extensive complements of electrical laboratory ever provided for an institution of this kind. And the New York Times praised its course in neon lighting, which taught the principles of the Great White Way, as Broadway was known. Most of its early students were from the Bronx and Upper Manhattan. By the early 70s, most students were Black and Latino. One of its more famous graduates was the hip hop legend Grandmaster Flash. Girls were first admitted in the 1980s. The school closed in 2012 and was converted to an educational campus containing 3 independent secondary schools. And the Benjamin Franklin High School on the East River represents the rich history of the social and political engagement of East Harlem in the mid-20th century. Established as East Harlem's first high school under the leadership of the school leader, activist, urban sociologist, and East Harlem resident Leonard Covello, Benjamin Franklin High School is a highly visible feature of the neighborhood. Meant to reflect a commitment to community service through education, it opened as the neighborhood began to experience significant demographic changes from a once predominantly Italian-American community to a growing Latino one. The school became an important community space. It also adapted its curriculum to meet the needs of the Puerto Rican community, provided orientations in Spanish, for example, and formed a Puerto Rican cultural club, which actively engaged the families of East Harlem. The era from the 1940s to 60s began the modern civil rights movement. Led by the tireless work of Black activists and their allies, the movement achieved the passage of incremental but important laws and legal cases making segregation and discrimination illegal. This period also saw the significant growth of New York City's Latino and Asian American communities, the fight for LGBTQ rights and feminism. This era is also marked by the significant advancement and contribution in the arts, politics, sciences, and popular culture, all of which is represented throughout the city in designated landmarks. Post-war New York City saw the creation of vibrant African-American communities in neighborhoods like Addisley Park Historic District in Queens. Following the United States Supreme Court decision that held restrictive covenants in violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, Addisley Park, where such a covenant had forbidden the sale of properties to African Americans, became home to the richest and most gifted Black New Yorkers in the 1950s. Residents of the district included W.E.B. Du Bois, musicians Thomas Fats Waller, William James Count Basie, Milt Hinton, Ella Fitzgerald, Lena Horne, and many others, including Jackie Robinson. Also in Queens, LPC designated the Louis Armstrong's home in Corona in 1988. Born in New Orleans in 1901, Louis Armstrong was a world-renowned jazz musician, singer, entertainer, and film star. He and his wife Lucille purchased this modest house in 1943, and it was their primary residence until their deaths in 1971 and 83, respectively. So this designation recognizes the important significance of Louis Armstrong, and also, of course, the changes that he himself made to the house. The commission is also considering 3 additional buildings that have important jazz history: Minton's Playhouse in Harlem, the home of Duke Ellington and Noble Sissel, and also the home of Dizzy Gillespie, who was a good friend of Louis Armstrong and lived just around the corner, and they used to meet together at Dizzy Gillespie's house in his recording studio. In 1945, New York saw the repeal of the discriminatory Chinese Exclusion Act, first passed in 1882. And by the 1960s, Manhattan's Chinatown was rapidly expanding, and new Chinatown communities were formed in Brooklyn and Queens. Designed by Chinese-American architect Poi Gum Lee and dedicated in 1962, the Kim Lau War Memorial in Chinatown was sponsored by the American Legion to honor Chinese-American soldiers who died while serving in the United States military. Despite being denied full citizenship and facing extensive racial discrimination, approximately 20,000 Chinese Americans enlisted and fought for the United States during World War II. The memorial is named after Second Lieutenant Benjamin Ralph Kimlau, a Chinese American pilot who died while attacking Japanese military installations in the South Pacific. The memorial sits at the epicenter of Chinatown as a site of honor, an important place of pride, gathering, and remembrance. While there are other landmarks in Chinatown, this is the first that specifically recognizes Chinese American heritage there. Discrimination and exclusion of lesbians and gay people from public life dates back to the beginning of our country's history. After World War II and through the 1950s, an increasing number of anti-gay laws were passed around the country, legalizing discrimination and making life for lesbians and gays even more restrictive. The discriminatory environment of the 1950s and 60s meant that very few people would acknowledge they were homosexual, and lesbian and gay activists strove merely to have their right to exist recognized. New York City's LGBTQ+ community has made significant contributions to arts and culture, and despite the obstacles they faced, have thrived in New York City. The following sites have been designated as individual landmarks in recognition of their incredible LGBTQ significance. The Julius's Bar Building, designated last year, is New York City's most significant site of pre-Stonewall LGBTQ activism. In 1966, at a time where authorities viewed the mere presence of LGBTQ people on a premises as inherently disorderly, gay rights activists from the Mattachine Society staged a demonstration at Julius's to protest the closure of gay bars and any bars serving gay people. And the event came to be known as the Sip-In. It exemplified the movement's eagerness to confront society's persecution and embrace direct action modeled on the civil rights movement. Cafe Chino is culturally significant, and that's the one in the middle, as the birthplace of Off Broadway and as New York City's first gay theater. Cafe Chino occupied the ground floor at 31 Cornelia Street from 1958 to 1968, a time when portraying homosexuality in theater productions was a criminal offense. The cafe, run by Joe Chino, fostered a supportive atmosphere for new and unknown playwrights, most of whom were gay men. The venue also established the off-Broadway theater scene, freed from the usual financial and narrative constraints of Broadway and off-Broadway projects. And then in the late 1960s, peaceful rallies and acts of protest led to the defining moment of the Stonewall Rebellion in Greenwich Village. On June 28, 1969, the Stonewall Inn was raided, and rather than dispersing, the bar's customers remained and began to protest. The police retreated into the bar, which became the focus of protests and confrontations for a few days. And the legacy of Stonewall was the inspiration of a nationwide movement to secure LGBT civil rights. And a lot of important groups really were born after that. And the first was the Gay Activists Alliance. They opened a headquarters and community center in a former firehouse in Soho, designed by Napoleon Lebrun and built in 1881. The GAA was most active in 1971 to 74 when this building served as its headquarters, an important community gathering place for LGBTQ rights movement. This designation recognizes that cultural significance and the impacts that this group had on the continuing movement. And the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender community center in Greenwich Village, shown on the right, is also significant for its role in the growth and development of LGBTQ rights in the city. And it's been active for 40 years in this building. It was built in the 19th century as a school, and it now houses an archival collection, cultural programming. It is important career services, and it's had a very important role in promoting health and wellness programs, including crucially during the AIDS epidemic. Women have fought for equal rights in our society and as part of the LGBTQ rights movement, and still are. We all are. And the Women's Liberation Center, located in Chelsea, is culturally significant as an important gathering place for a collective force of women-led groups, committees, and organizations pushing for radical political action, serving all women. From 1972 to 1987, this city-owned former firehouse was really the epicenter for women's engagement in the LGBT civil rights movement, and housed some of the most influential organizations working to bring public attention to the discrimination and legal injustices faced by lesbians and women. And on the right is at 484 14th Street in Park Slope, is a culturally significant as the home since 1991 of the Lesbian Her Story Archives, the nation's oldest and largest collection of lesbian-related historical material. It's headquarters for over 30 years. This Renaissance revival style building is where the entirely volunteer-run archives expanded its collection and grew to national prominence. And these two landmarks, designated in June 2019, also recognize significant African-American writers and poets who were also very important activists in both African-American civil rights and LGBTQ civil rights. 137 West 71st Street in Manhattan was the American residence and family headquarters of the celebrated novelist, essayist, poet, and civil rights advocate James Baldwin from 1966 to his death in 1987. And on the right, we have the home of Audre Lorde from 1972 to 1987, the poet, essayist, feminist, and civil rights activist, lived here with her partner and family. And it's where she wrote many of her important books, and was appointed the Poet Laureate for New York State in 1991. New York's Latino community has been present through its history, grew considerably in the 20th century. After the 1917 Jones Act recognized Puerto Ricans as American citizens, the Puerto Rican population in East Harlem grew steadily. The South Bronx, the Village, Lower East Side, Washington Heights, among other neighborhoods, also attracted significant Latino populations. In 1940, there were approximately 61,000 Puerto Ricans living in New York, and by 1950, that number had climbed to 245,000. The East Village, Lower East Side Historic District recognizes the layers of significant immigrant history in this neighborhood. Starting with the large German community that settled here, and it was known as Klein Deutschland, or Little Germany. It transformed to what was known as the Yiddish Rialto by 1910, when it became the most important entertainment district for the city's Jewish immigrant community, and continued to evolve into an important center for Puerto Rican and Latin American culture in the 1950s. And the Holyrood Episcopal Church, Iglesia Santa Cruz, also represents a layered history built in Washington Heights in the early 20th century, and attracting a really strong, predominantly Dominican community. And currently calendared is the Bronx Opera House in the South Bronx, where for the Puerto Rican community, music and dance performances were the expression of their identity and culture. And at the beginning of the 1960s, the Bronx Opera House really became one of the most significant artistic and cultural centers for this expression in the area. It was built in the early 20th century. It had Broadway shows, and then later transitioned into being this epicenter of Latin music. And we'll wrap up with Shirley Chisholm, who is a significant woman, the first woman to run for president, the first African-American woman to be in Congress. She lived in several places in the Crown Heights North historic districts. So we have that reflection of her history and significance, where she lived and ran her campaigns. And she's just made and was very inspirational to countless Americans, in particular women and African Americans, who went on to pursue elective office or work for social and political change. So we've reached the end of our list of landmarks, and I know it was longer than just the selection, but there's so many more, and it is very hard to whittle it down. But I'm delighted to have at least given you this kind of brief overview. We have a lot of tools on our website. Designation reports, we've, since the early years of the commission have changed, and they were initially one page, and now they're much more thorough and really go into much more depth about the history that landmarks represent. So they're all available on our website, and understanding that they are regulatory documents and may not always be able to find connections between these designated landmarks. We've started making these story maps that really start to tie together stories thematically and put landmarks on a map that can be interactive and really get kind of the highlights of the story and then dig as deep as you would like. So I encourage you to go to our website. This is some of the examples of those story maps. And again, thank you so much, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Kate, thank you so much. You really gave us this really in-depth chronological tour of the cultural and diverse history of New York. And to quote the word you used, you really covered how layered, how many, many different layers it was. So thank you so much. I will say some more words at the end, but now at the moment, I'd like to take questions from our in-person audience and indeed our online audience. Do we have any questions?
So my question is regarding the process of the archives, like what are the resources that you have and how you operate as a team, and looking, through the cultural aspects as well as probably the building records and things like that. So if you could just kind of give us a breakdown how you pull all the information together
Sure.
for this.
Yeah. Well, we have, as I said, very dedicated researchers, and the city thankfully has a lot of great resources to document historic buildings and the history of people. So we do have things like the, municipal archives that has original sort of plans and applications, docket books. We have the buildings department also has historic. It's, you have to find it on the microfiche, but you can get the original construction drawings, often alterations over time. We do a lot of map research to see more broadly how a community changes, and to see, okay, this was residential, here's where the institutions were, this was maybe where manufacturing was, but then you see that leave. So you kind of get an overview of what was happening there. Historic newspapers and periodicals are really helpful too. And so much more is available online now. It's wonderful. So you can find articles that were printed in local newspapers. There's a lot of through, a membership in newspapers.com, or, many sort of memberships, you can get access to African-American newspapers. We do a lot of census research to really see actually who lived in buildings. And we do that kind of to get a sense of a neighborhood, but also specific history. And then, of course, scholarship that's come before, we refer to, important books and secondary resources as well.
Thank you very much. This has been incredible. What exactly is the significance of designating a place a landmark? And does it also affect or limit the ability to modify the inside of the building or area? Thanks.
Good question. And I should have said that in the beginning to give you the background. So what it takes to designate a building is this kind of research and really evaluating and understanding what kind of significance a place has. Some places are significant for their architecture. Some are significant because of a long association with an important person. Some are a combination. Some buildings are, less architecturally significant, but have undeniable historical or cultural significance. We also have to look at how intact the building is, because we regulate buildings. And so we regulate historic fabric. And so there has to be something that we can ask someone to preserve. So that can be challenging when there's an important history, but there's really nothing left to restore and I will segue into the next part of your question. We work with people who come to us with their proposed changes. So when a building is designated, that doesn't mean that someone has to restore it. We can't make someone restore a building. So we work with people who come to us, and we work, the staff is incredibly knowledgeable and helpful and very hands-on. And so we work with people to get what they want to do for their building in a way that's appropriate and that preserves its character.
Right. We have sort of a related question. What do you do to help? This is from Sue online. What do you do to help endangered landmarks? And Sue gives the specific example of the old Merchant's House on East 4th Street, which is endangered because of new construction. Could you talk about the advocacy work of the LPC?
Sure. Yes. So while we can't make an owner restore a building to an original appearance, part of being a landmark is it must be kept in a safe condition. And so we work very carefully when we're reviewing plans to make sure that what is being proposed is safe for the building and preserves its structure as well as its architectural features. We also require, when work is being done next to a building, that there's a protection plan in place. So our staff is very carefully looking at those. And so that also makes sure that, there can be sensors put on the building that look at potential vibrations or things like that. So that's also an important part of it. And we do have a department that is sort of looking at how, if work is not being done correctly. And so there are violations that can be given if in that case. But it's an important question and an important issue. And we're also working very closely with the Department of Buildings to make sure that there's open communication and that we're always aware of this kind of work so that we can make sure it's safe for our buildings.
Thank you.
Hi. Hi. In terms of designation, there was an administration that shortened down the time for designating a property. And so has that hurt the landmarks preservation in maintaining or trying to designate a lot of the properties? Because I know it went down to maybe 90 days. When I was at buildings department, and once the building was calendared and it was in the database, you had to go through landmarks to get approval when a landlord wanted to make any changes. But once you cut down that amount of time for the research that is required, are you losing some buildings to that because you don't have the time to really get it in on time?
The current law requires that once a building is calendared, we have a year to designate it for an individual landmark, or 2 for a historic district. So normally it goes through in, between 3 and 6 months, I would say. But we do try to have a lot of research done at the time of calendaring to make that case for significance to go into the formal process. But we've found that the time limit enforced by that law is very workable. We can do what we need to within that.
And how does Historic District Council help you in a way to I've been involved with that organization I'm an architect, so I just love landmarking and, maintaining our heritage. And I know they're like champions in trying to help landmarks preservation in keeping good stuff, but do they get in your way in a certain?
No, I mean, it's a good question. And there is, there's different roles of being a preservationist in the city, and there's advocacy, and there's the Landmarks Commission, and then a whole lot in between. And I think we find advocates really to be good partners. And, groups like the Conservancy or the HDC, it can be helpful in many different ways. The Conservancy helps with all of your programs like this, and then with funding and helping guide people through the process. The Sacred Sites program is incredible, and HDC and Save Harlem Now and other groups that really kind of help bring advocacy in the communities. Owner support is very important for what we can achieve. People have to understand the responsibilities and how to work with us. And also political support is important because our designations go through a process at the city council. So there's all these layers of that. But I think, the groups that kind of can help us get in contact with owners and build support and build political will, it's helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you for a very informative lecture. Your theme was diversity, and it sure was. You had the diversity of people, residents, you had the diversity of buildings, but all this has to be guided. What are the parameters that guide you in your work? Is there a code of parameters? Who writes the code of parameters? And who, in the end, endorses it so that you can carry on with your work? Thank you.
Very good question. And I think we are guided by the landmarks law, which does not have specific criteria, except that it's architecturally, historically, culturally significant for a landmark. So we're really guided by, and it's hard. This is a huge city where so many important people have lived and worked and have been important in their communities. And so we don't feel that we are in the sort of position of being the arbiter of who's important, but we have to have a rigor in how we really establish significance. So we look at things like the influence of the person within their field, is it citywide or kind of just in the neighborhood? We look at how strong an association is with the building. Did they live there for a year and then move on? And there's other buildings also associated with them. So it's really this combination, I would say, of looking at those kind of factors. And that's also in keeping with the national standards as well for criteria for significance. Did that help?
Hi.
Hi.
On average, how many requests for a landmark designation do you receive a year? And of all the requests you've been involved with, what was the easiest to approve? What was the most challenging and why?
Oof. Well, I will start out by just saying that we, unlike maybe some other commissions in other parts of the country, or even like the National Register, where it's done by nomination, there is not an application process for a landmark. So there's not, a request that then is going to go into a process. But we get what we call requests for evaluation, which we study very carefully. And we determine if something meets, standards for consideration. And then we let people know. And then that's added to our survey inventory. And that helps to inform our priorities in terms of what will be coming forward as a potential designation. And we're always looking, right, we're focused on looking throughout the city. We're focused on greater equity and representation in our landmarks and communities, parts of the city that are less well served by designations. There's various aspects that inform what our priorities are at any given time. So I can't think of what I can answer your second part with. Because I think, things do come with a lot of thought and a lot of process and evaluation. And I think, that takes time. And I know sometimes people are frustrated by that amount of time, but we are always working away to try to move things forward.
Right. Thank you. There'll be I'm going to take one more question, and it's online, and it is also related to designation. And this is a specific example. So not to put you on the spot, Kate, but this is an example, perhaps. This is from our attendee online. In the New Yorker, I recently read about Jean Mantford, founder of Parents of Gay, later PFLAG. She lived in Queens, I assume in a modest house. Would a building like her house be eligible for landmarks designation?
Oh, that's a good question. I know that house, and that is certainly a culturally significant house. So I would say yes.
Oh, well, well, what a great answer. Kate, I just want to express our huge appreciation for your extremely comprehensive presentation and, the wonderful work that LPC do. And thank you so much for highlighting it. And you covered so much, and all the interesting facts, for instance, the role of the Chinese in the Second World War. I, for one, did not know that. And you covered so many other things. And thank you for recognizing our diverse city. So thank you so much, Kate.
Thank you so much.
And just to say a few words, Victoria Dangle, our Executive Director.
Kate, thank you so much. That was wonderful. But I have a question.
Yes.
In terms of the Landmarks Preservation Commission, I don't think many people think of visiting the website to get information. How is the website? Do they have, I know you highlighted specific topics tonight, but say somebody wanted to find out more, about their, say I'm, for everyone who's wondering, I am Sicilian and German Irish. But so if I wanted to go on the Landmarks Commission, Preservation Commission website and think about visiting a neighborhood other than the obvious, like Little Italy, where does it direct you?
That's a really good question. And I think sort of is the answer. Like, you can really find a lot of information about our landmarks. And we have what we call the Discover NYC Landmarks map, which you can search by address, you can search by landmark name, you can find a designation report. And so that will take you if you kind of know what you're looking for. And then the story maps are intended to help that bring things into a theme. The map is also searchable by some search fields. So you can look up, but they're more related to the building. So it's more about architect, style, date kind of thing. We have been working to create data about kind of thematic significance. So that's an ongoing project.
Okay. And I just want to say something, as a native New Yorker, I feel very blessed that I grew up in the city where, it's just full of people from every walk of life. And it doesn't seem like anything foreign to me. And it's just what makes our city exciting. It's what makes every single day interesting, interaction after interaction. So I just have to say, as a New Yorker, I feel blessed to live in the greatest city in the world. So thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you again to Kate and indeed to LPC for highlighting that diversity. Kate, we have a small memento of the evening, the poster.
Thank you.
No, and we're also very fortunate because this is the second time that Kate has spoken here. So thank you so much, Kate. And also I want to thank Lisa Easton, who suggested Kate as a speaker, a landmark speaker. So thank you so much to you, our audience, both online and in person. I want just to mention our upcoming lecture, and forgive me, which is basically, it's about the Great Fire of New York. And that is next Tuesday. The actual title is The Great Fire of New York, 1776, A Lost Story of the American Revolution with Professor Benjamin Karp. So thank you all so much for joining us again this evening. I hope our in-person audience will join us for a glass of wine. And again, our great appreciation to Kate and to the LBC. Thank you so much.
Thank you.